So in this video, we're going to talk about the basics of light and shadow. We're going to touch on a couple of core concepts of light logic and how it applies to the four fundamental shapes of nature: the cube, the sphere, the cylinder, and the cone. As we learn about light and shadow and about light logic, we come to realize that there are four fundamental rules or core concepts that always apply. So the first is that light behaves predictably. These rules don't change. Light always behaves this way. And once we understand that, we can then break down and apply our light and shadow knowledge to every situation. The second is that light always travels in straight lines. Whenever a beam of light changes path, it's because there is an object that has acted upon that light to redirect it and change. But when it's redirected, it continues traveling in a straight line until something else impacts it. The third is that a light source is always brighter than the reflected light that is a result of that light source. Lastly, shadows made by light are always a direct response to that light. And it's impacted by whatever the light hits, so the object it hits, the angle the light is coming from, and the intensity of the light source. The easiest way to learn about and to apply this light logic is to think about it with a single hard light source. A single hard light source will demonstrate each distinct area of a form that we have to be aware of. It helps to exaggerate the widest tonal range, and it's the easiest way to see the difference in tones when you're a beginner. The problem with trying to incorporate more than one light source or multiple light sources, when you have multiple sources of light impacting an object, it can change the way light accentuates the form and the volume of that object. You'll end up losing the definition between your lights and shadows, and especially for a beginner, it can make it very difficult to understand and to learn. So if you're just learning out, if you're trying to understand how to apply your lights and shadows, it's best to only have a single hard light source. Practice with that, learn from that, and once you've mastered how to apply your light tones and your midtones and your dark tones using a single source, you can slowly expand and add more sources of light. So when we talk about light and shadow and how it impacts and creates form in an object, there's four parts we have to think about. There is the light side, there is the shadow side, there is a cast shadow, and there is the shadow line. So if we imagine a circular object and our light source coming from this direction, this is our beam of light. And so on this object, everything, if you imagine all these little surfaces, anything facing towards this light, even remotely, is going to catch some light. The edges or surfaces that are starting to face away from our light source will actually catch no light. And then any of our areas facing the opposite direction is where we're going to catch reflected light that's being bounced off of other objects from behind and impacting our object. This area of the object that's directly catching the light, we call our light side. This area of our object where it is not directly facing the light in any way, that's our shadow. Within our light area, the point that faces most direct to our light, we call our highlight. This is the brightest point on our object because it's directly facing the light and it catches the most light. Every other plane in this area, we call a halftone. All the values in this halftone area are always going to be brighter in value than anything on the shadow side. Where the light and the shadow sides meet, right along this line, we are going to call our shadow line. And within that shadow line, or just past it, is where we have our shadow core. or our darkest part of the shadow area. And that is because this part of the object doesn't face our light source, and it doesn't face any object or any plane opposite to catch any reflected light. And because there's going to be no light at all impacting this part, it is the shadow core, the darkest part of the shadow. Everything along this area is the rest of our shadow. The dark tones that blend away from the shadow core or the shadow line and into our reflected light. When we think about reflected light, this is light that reflects back onto our object from a surface it sits on, surrounding objects. The intensity of the reflected light depends on the initial intensity of our initial light source, as well as the properties of the object reflecting the light, the object receiving the light, and the distance from the source and to the object. I know it's a lot to think about, and when you're just starting, you're probably not going to be thinking too much about reflected light at all. But just remember that the reflected light as part of our shadow area, its values are always going to be darker than any values in our light area. And what that means is the darkest shade within our light area is still always going to be brighter than the brightest reflected light in our shadow area. The last part that we also want to talk about is a cast shadow. This is not something that you typically worry about as often is in miniature painting unless you are deliberately painting them in. But the cast shadow is essentially a shadow that is cast by the object and is in direct response to whatever the light source is. So for in this example, because the object blocks the light in this sort of a space, the cast shadow is going to sit in this area, and because it's a curve, the cast shadow will curve. The cast shadow always takes the shape of whatever the object is blocking the light. So if it were a square, for example, and our light source is coming from this direction, our cast shadow would look a little something like this. With an object like this being our square, it's fairly easy to figure out where our light side, our shadow side, and our shadow core or shadow line is going to be. These two edges face the light, and they're going to be in our light side, with the highlight probably somewhere either on this edge or along this point, depending on how the square is arranged. This is our shadow area. Our shadow line is going to be right at these 2 points. And then any sort of ambient light or reflected light will depend on what objects are going to be around. If there's something from behind, then we're going to see some reflected light over there. So that's really how we break down the parts of our lights and shadows on an object. It's really these 4 core forms. That's our light side, our shadow side. We're going to have our shadow line or core shadow, and then the cast shadow that's reflected as a result of the light source and the object. So when we think about objects in nature, there's really only 4 fundamental shapes that we have to understand. It's the cube, the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. When we say fundamental, because every object in nature can be broken down into some variation of these 4 objects or a combination thereof. And if we understand light logic and how it applies to these 4 basic shapes, we can then start to break down any sort of object that we see in real life. And we can break down how to properly light and shadow that object based on these 4 forms and how they can compose an object. So my light source is right here from this direction, as you can see. And you can see that this is a highlight in our light area. And so is this plane. So these 2 planes, because our light source is here, and these 2 are facing it in some direction. This plane is our shadow side. We have a bit of a dark shadow here, and then it's subtle, but this part right here is where our shadow core is. And if you freeze frame and color grab it, you can actually see that the colors along this edge are just slightly darker than this. And if we move our light source to something above, you can see how it's changed where our brightest plane is. Move to the top. And we're catching a bit of light on both of these sides because our cast shadow is in the opposite direction. So these two would actually remain in our light side. If I move my light source behind, you can see now that both these sides are in my shadow area. You can see that this edge along here and this edge are slightly darker in value compared to these two. Squares are relatively easy because with hard light sources, the flat planes don't create a lot of area of gradient, especially at this scale, going to be fairly uniform in value, and you're not going to see huge jumps in value. If we take our sphere, we can begin to see how these forms come into play. Again, my light source is coming from this direction, and so my shadow line actually sits right there. You can see that this core shadow right here is the darkest part of my shadow area. The shadow line exists here, and everything from this point on is my light side. My light source is coming from this direction, so my highlight point is somewhere right here. Shadow area, you can see the beginnings of reflected light bouncing off of the table, and then the cast shadow. Now, because the light source is coming from fairly low to the table, the cast shadow is a medium, moderate size. My light is at about 3/4 of an angle, creating this kind of a cast shadow. If I bring the light source above the ball, you can see that the shadow is getting smaller and smaller until it sits just beneath the object. You can also see with the light source directly above, it's pushing all of our shadow areas below. And from our angle, our viewing angle, we don't see much of the shadow line or the shadow area. If I were to bring the light source down to the table and off to the side, you can very clearly see the cast shadow gets super huge. We have a bit of reflected light here, but look at our nice visible shadow line and core shadow. This deep area is not reflecting or receiving any light, and it's our darkest part of our shadow. Reflected light here, shadow line, and our light area with our highlight point. If I bring my light towards this angle, you now see that the highlight area has moved to this spot, and we can still see a hint of the shadow line right there. So this cylinder combines some of the properties of a cube. It has a flat top and bottom, as well as a bit of the curvature to bring in some of the behaviors that we see in the sphere. With my light source coming from this direction, you can see that my highlight point actually sits right on this edge, because that's the part of the object directly facing the light. The top surface and this area are my light area, and my shadow area begins somewhere right around here. If I move the light source to the side, much like a sphere, you can see my light area goes right down to my shadow. My shadow line begins right here. And this element is my shadow core. It's the darkest part. We're going to get a bit of reflected light around here, just a touch from the table. And then because this top surface still faces a bit of the light, it also sits in our light area. With the light source coming from this direction behind our object, the top is still somewhat facing the light source, so it sits in our light area. The entire back of the cylinder is now in our shadow area. Our shadow line is going to sit where our light area, light side and shadow side meet, and we're going to have a touch of a core shadow right here. You can see that it is slightly darker right here, and it bleeds in a little bit right here with our reflected light. A cone is basically a cylinder with only one flat side and a pointed tip. The behavior on the cone is going to be very similar to a cylinder. However, because it does reach a point, we're going to see an interesting fan out with our gradient. Where a gradient on a cylinder, if we imagine the light source is coming from this direction, we're going to have our shadow line right there. So a cylinder exhibits shadowing on its cylindrical area very uniformly. A cone, however, does not. If we imagine our light source coming from this direction, we don't see the same kind of shading as a cylinder where it shades in a straight line up and down, but rather it's going to follow the angle of the edges. So if our shadow line were right down the middle, our values change in angle to match the curve of the body. Okay? So we can see that here. This is our shadow line, and we have our core shadow, our darkest part, right in this area before it starts moving into our reflected light. And then we have our light side, or our light area, with our highlight right at the tip and in this area, facing the light. You can see how the values move in conjunction with the change in angle of the conical area. With our light source coming in from the side, again, shadow line, core shadow, reflected light, and our light side with our highlight right around here. As our light moves above a cylinder, because this entire conical portion now faces the light, this entire area becomes our light side. And an interesting little haloing effect can sometimes appear depending on the angle, where we have a cool little ellipse where our brightest points are, and it moves into the slightly darker areas of our light side. Not our shadow area, but not as bright as our highlight. With a cone at this angle, you can see that we have our shadow line forming here and here, but because the table is directly underneath and it's getting a lot of reflected light, it's actually brightening up this entire area. We have our core shadow right here, brought down. It's our darkest area, sitting right underneath the shadow line, moving into reflected light. Our highlight is at the tip of the cylinder because it's the closest, most direct point facing the light, and our light side. So these are our 4 fundamental shapes, and everything in nature can be broken down into one of these 4 objects or a subset of the objects. Even if they aren't directly one of them, they share similar behaviors. A person's nose, for example, is really just a cone. And 3 spheres on the end. Where it gets to a person's brow, we can simplify it. Their eyes are there. We can simplify it into flat parts like cubes, right? Eyes are ovals. A lip might have a bit of an upside down cylinder. with some spherical elements right here, and then moving into more flat angled planes like a mouth. Right? The angle of lips. So when we paint our miniatures, and when we're creating art and we're trying to apply highlighting and shadowing, what we're really doing is we are applying this understanding of light logic to our work. And I hope that these core rules and I hope that these concepts will allow you to better understand where and how to apply your light and shadows. So I hope that breaks down some core concepts of light logic to you, and I hope that you're able to apply that to your miniature painting and to your art. You'll find that as you paint, if you're constantly thinking about this light logic and how the light source that you're choosing to illustrate impacts the lights and shadows on your object, you're going to find that it becomes easier and easier to apply this knowledge, and soon you'll be able to move on from a single light source to having multiple light sources, including more complex things like object source lighting and some really crazy reflected light. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content, and follow my Instagram at SirJohnTheHo for daily updates on my hobby progress. Until next time, happy hobbying.